I own a multi-million-dollar estate in Montana. Yet for 20 years, my husband has lived like a ghost in a freezing hunting cabin at the edge of the woods. It was his silent punishment for my unforgivable sin. We played the perfect, powerful couple for the public, but our marriage was a dead wasteland. I thought I knew the exact price of my lies, until a sudden back pain forced me into an MRI tube. Evelyn, looking at these scans, the doctor stopped, taking off his glasses, and with one sentence, my entire fake empire burned to ash. To understand the collapse of an empire, you have to look at its foundation. 20 years ago, I was 40, and my marriage to Arthur, well, it was never a fairy tale written in the stars. It was a merger drafted in a boardroom. My family owned prime real estate across the valley, and Arthur was the undisputed king of the Montana timber industry. Together, we were untouchable. We had the sprawling mansion, the pedigree, the absolute power. But behind the iron gates of our estate, the air was suffocating. Arthur was a man carved from the very mountains he owned. Cold, unyielding, practical to an absolute fault. He ruled our home the same way he ruled his logging camps, with absolute authority and a heavy, suffocating silence. There was no romance, no soft whispers in the dark, no lingering touches, just duty. The duty to expand our territory, the duty to project invincibility, the duty to raise our son, Leo, into the perfect, ruthless heir. My life was a rigid schedule of charity galas and board meetings. I was drowning in a sea of wealth, completely parched for a single drop of genuine affection. Then came Julian. Now, he was a freelance photographer hired by a national magazine to shoot the valley's untamed landscapes. He parked his battered Airstream near the edge of our lower pastures. Julian was everything Arthur was not. He chased the golden hour. He lived out of a backpack. He spoke about light and shadows with a passion that made my chest ache. I met him by chance while riding my horse near the river. We talked. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt truly seen. Not as Mrs. Arthur, the real estate magnate, just Evelyn. It started with innocent conversations by the water, then stolen afternoons in his Airstream, wrapped in a warmth I had forgotten existed. He listened to me. He looked at me like I was a piece of art, not a piece of property. It was a pathetic, desperate rebellion. I thought I was finding myself again. But I was just lighting a match in a powder keg. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was wrong. But the feeling of being desired again, it completely blinded me, until the day the blindfold was violently ripped off. I came home late one Tuesday afternoon. The house was dead quiet, the kind of heavy quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I walked into our grand master bedroom, and there was Arthur. He wasn't holding a stack of illicit photos. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't holding a gun. He was just packing a leather duffel bag. My heart stopped. Arthur. I started, my voice trembling like a leaf in the winter wind. He didn't even look at me. I know about the photographer. His voice was perfectly flat. No rage, no tears, just absolute ice. I collapsed to my knees, sobbing, grabbing at his boots. I told him it meant nothing, that it was a stupid mistake, that I was so sorry. He zipped the bag shut. The sound echoed in the massive room like a gunshot. He finally turned to me, his eyes dark and hollow, stripping me bare. "Save your tears, Evelyn." He walked toward the door, then stopped, his broad shoulders blocking the light. "We are not getting a divorce. The stock prices would plummet. The land grants would be tied up in court for a decade, and I will not let you drag Leo's name through the mud of a cheap public scandal." I looked up at him, confused, terrified. Then, "What happens now?" I whispered. Arthur looked down at me with a disgust so pure it burned my skin. "We have a deal, you and I. In front of the board, in front of the town, and most importantly, in front of our son. You will play the perfect, devoted wife. You will smile for the cameras. You will host the galas. But when the doors close, We are nothing. I am moving to the hunting cabin. Your life is your own, but you will never cross that tree line." And just like that, he walked out. I lay on the cold hardwood floor, listening to the heavy thud of the front door closing, followed by the crunch of his truck tires on the gravel. I ended it with Julian the next day, a quick, cowardly phone call. I thought Arthur's reaction was just the initial shock of betrayal. I thought, give him a few weeks, maybe a few months, and he would eventually scream, demand answers, maybe even forgive me. I was so incredibly naive. When Arthur moved his clothes to that rusted, drafty hunting cabin at the edge of the woods, he wasn't just taking space to clear his head, he was building a prison. And he was locking me inside my own castle. I used to think my mansion was a fortress, but after that day it became a tomb. 20 rooms, sweeping staircases, vaulted ceilings, and not a single echo of a human voice. The physical distance between the main house and the hunting cabin was exactly 400 yards. I measured it once, but it might as well have been 1,000,000 miles. Arthur never stepped foot inside the house unless it was absolutely necessary. He managed the timber empire from his study in the cabin. I managed the emptiness of the estate. The most excruciating part wasn't the isolation itself, it was the performance we had to put on. Every December, we hosted the annual Shareholders Gala, hundreds of the wealthiest people in Montana filling our ballroom. Arthur would walk in, wearing his tailored suit, me smelling of pine and expensive bourbon. He would slide his arm around my waist, his grip firm, his smile perfectly crafted for the cameras. "You have such a beautiful home, Evelyn," the investors' wives would say. "Arthur is so devoted." We would clink our champagne glasses. We would nod. But the moment the last guest's car rolled down the driveway, his arm would drop. He wouldn't say goodnight. He wouldn't even look at me. He would just turn on his heel, walk out the heavy oak doors, and disappear into the freezing, snowy night, leaving me standing there in a diamond necklace, entirely alone. People are terrified of explosive arguments, but trust me, anger at least carries the warmth of a living, breathing human being. What I had to endure for 20 years was absolute suffocating silence. It wasn't just an absence of sound. When it was a living, breathing entity, it was a thick, freezing fog that choked the life out of every single room. There were nights I would stand by the window, looking out at the faint yellow light burning in his cabin. I would press my forehead against the freezing glass and pray, actually pray, that he would burst through the front door, slap me across the face, scream the most vile words he could think of, or smash every piece of crystal in the dining room. If he did that, it would mean he still saw me as a human being. It would mean I still existed in his world. But no, he walked past me like I was made of glass, like I was completely transparent. I slowly realized that cold violence is the most wicked weapon you can use to assassinate a soul. It strips away your right to explain yourself. It strips away your right to cry. And worst of all, it strips away your right to atone. When you hurt someone and they react, you have a window to say you are sorry. But when they refuse to receive a single signal from you, those apologies just pool in your throat. Day after day, year after year, they ferment into a poison that eats you alive from the inside out. I wasn't living during those 20 years. I was just slowly decaying inside a giant refrigerator disguised as a marriage. And Leo, my sweet Leo, was growing up right in the middle of this frozen wasteland. I tried to overcompensate. I became the perfect mother, the perfect estate manager, making his favorite meals, cheering the loudest at his rodeo competitions. Arthur was there too, cheering from the stands, being the perfect stoic father. But we never sat together. Leo started to notice. Of course he did. And he would ask why Dad liked the cabin so much. I would force a smile and say, "Dad just needs quiet for his work, honey." It was a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. I was dying for a single word of forgiveness, but forgiveness is a luxury for the living, and in Arthur's eyes, I was already dead. As the years dragged on, Leo grew into everything Arthur had ever envisioned. He was strong, brilliantly sharp, a fearless star in the rodeo arena, and the undisputed future of our timber empire. He was our pride, but you cannot hide a frozen wasteland from a child who is forced to live inside it. A child knows when a house has no heartbeat. Leo would look at us across the massive oak dining table, his eyes catching the vast empty space between our hands. "Mom, why do you and Dad always look like you are posing for a photograph?" he asked me one evening. I could not breathe. I gave him the same tired, hollow excuses about the overwhelming stress of the family business, but his question broke something inside me. That night, the suffocating weight of my guilt finally crushed me. I walked out into the freezing snow, my bare hands going numb, and I crossed the tree line to the hunting cabin. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The smell of wood smoke and expensive bourbon hit me immediately. Arthur was sitting by the fire reading a ledger. He did not even look up. "Arthur, please," I whispered, falling to my knees on the rough, splintered floorboards. "I can't do this anymore. Punish me, hate me, take every single cent of my shares. But let me go. Let us get a divorce. This house is a graveyard and we are just haunting it." He took a slow sip of his drink, and the firelight flickered across his face, making his features look like a mask carved from ice. "Get up, Evelyn." I grabbed the hem of his heavy coat, tears streaming down my freezing face. "Please, I'm begging you, let us both be free. Leo is old enough to understand. We don't have to die like this." He set the glass down with a sharp, violent thud. "Free? There is no freedom. You think you can just burn down my legacy, humiliate my name, and walk away to find your happiness. We stay married. End of discussion." He turned his back to me, the ultimate dismissal. For the longest time after that night, I thought his refusal to divorce me was just pure, vindictive cruelty. I thought he was keeping me trapped just to watch me suffer, to extract his daily payment of my pain. But sitting alone in the dark of my massive empty bedroom, I finally understood the agonizing truth about my husband. He wasn't just punishing me, he was punishing himself. In business and behavioral psychology, there is a concept called the sunk cost fallacy. It is the human tendency to desperately hold on to a losing, toxic investment simply because you have already poured too much time, money, or blood into it. In marriage, this trap is 1,000 times more devastating. Why didn't Arthur divorce me the moment he found out about my betrayal? It wasn't just to protect Leo's feelings. It wasn't just to keep our land grants and stock prices from collapsing. Deep down, Arthur was a proud, arrogant conqueror. At 40 years old, he simply could not stomach the reality that the 2 decades of his youth, his passion, and his ultimate vision of a perfect dynasty was a complete and utter failure. Now, admitting defeat was worse than death to a man like him, so he chose to keep the rotting corpse of our marriage propped up in the window for the world to see. He held on to a dead asset, convincing himself that as long as the legal papers were signed and the empire stood tall, he had not lost. But the tragic irony of the sunk cost fallacy is that in your desperate attempt to save a broken investment from the past, you accidentally throw your entire future into a bottomless pit. Walking away from a dead marriage is not a failure. Under the cold lens of behavioral psychology, a divorce at that moment would have been the ultimate stop-loss. It was the only logical way to cut the bleeding and save the rest of his life. But Arthur refused to stop the loss. He dragged us both into the abyss, choosing the freezing, lonely walls of a hunting cabin over the terrifying reality of starting over. He refused to let me go, but in doing so, he locked himself in the exact same prison. I turned 60 this year. They say the body keeps a record of all your unspoken grief. And maybe they are right. 2 decades of walking through a frozen house, carrying the weight of a dead marriage, finally caught up with me. It started as a dull ache in my lower back, then turned into a blinding, paralyzing pain that made it impossible to even stand straight. My physician sent me to a specialist in town for a full spinal MRI. I hated that machine. Lying inside that claustrophobic humming tube felt exactly like my life, trapped in a cold, sterile cylinder with no way out. When the scan was finally over, I sat in the doctor's office waiting for the results. Doctor. Harris was a sharp, meticulous man. He stared at his computer screen for a very long time. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. He finally turned his monitor toward me, taking off his glasses. "Evelyn," he started, his voice unusually careful. "We found the source of your back pain. You have some severe nerve compression in your lower lumbar spine. We can treat it. But looking at your lower pelvic scans, I have to ask you a question for your medical history. When exactly did you have your oophorectomy?" I stared at him, completely blank. "My what?" "Your ovary removal, Evelyn." He pointed to a dark void on the black and white scan. "Your right ovary and fallopian tube are completely missing. There is significant surgical scar tissue here. I need to know when this procedure was done so we can update your chart." My heart started to pound against my ribs. "I have never had an ovary removed, Dr. Harris. I have never had any major abdominal surgery in my entire life." He frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "Evelyn, the imaging is undeniable. You are missing an ovary. A surgery absolutely took place. Please, think back. Was there ever an emergency? An accident where you were under general anesthesia?" My mind started racing, spinning out of control. An accident. Anesthesia. And then, a memory hit me with the force of a freight train. 20 years ago. The exact same summer Julian came into my life. The same summer Arthur moved out to the hunting cabin. I had been driving back from Julian's Airstream. It was raining heavily. The roads were slick and my tires lost traction on a sharp bend. I crashed into a wooden fence. It was not a fatal crash, but my head slammed against the steering wheel. I blacked out. When I finally opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. The fluorescent lights were blinding, and Arthur was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, staring at me with dead, empty eyes. My lower abdomen was burning with a horrific, deep pain. "What happened?" I had whispered, reaching for my stomach. "You crashed your car," Arthur had said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "And while you were unconscious, they found a ruptured ovarian cyst. It was causing massive internal bleeding. I had to sign the surgical consent forms. They removed it. You are fine now." I had believed him. Why wouldn't I? I was drugged, terrified, and overwhelmed by the guilt of where I had just been before the crash. Sitting in the clinic now, 20 years later, the sterile walls began to spin. Dr. Harris," I choked out, my hands trembling violently. If a woman was in the early stages of a pregnancy, an ectopic pregnancy, or if there were complications from a crash, would the surgery look like this? Dr. Harris looked at me, his expression softening into deep pity. "Yes. If a pregnancy had to be surgically terminated due to severe trauma or ectopic complications, the removal of the ovary and tube is standard protocol to save the mother's life." I could not breathe. The air in the room completely vanished. It wasn't a ruptured cyst. I had been pregnant. I had been pregnant with Julian's child. Arthur knew. The doctors must have told him when they ran my blood work in the emergency room. He knew I was carrying another man's baby, and while I lay unconscious on an operating table, my husband signed the papers to have it ripped out of me. He killed my child, and he hid it from me for 20 years. I do not even remember leaving the clinic. The next thing I knew, my hands were glued to the steering wheel of my car, tearing down the icy mountain roads toward the estate. The snow was falling in heavy, blinding sheets, but I just pressed the gas pedal harder. My entire body was trembling violently, not from the freezing winter air, but from a horror so absolute it felt like my bones were splintering. How? How in God's name did I not know? I screamed the question into the empty car, my voice cracking. How does a mother not know she was carrying a child? How do you lose a piece of your own body, a piece of your very soul, and just wake up the next day completely oblivious? I felt like a monster, a foolish, pathetic monster. For 20 years, I thought I was the sole villain of our story. I thought I was the one who shattered our family, and I accepted every ounce of Arthur's silent torture because I believed I deserved it. But him? He played God with my body while I was bleeding out on an operating table. When people hear a story like this, they immediately assume I must be lying. They think it is physically impossible to endure a major surgery, to lose a pregnancy, and just forget it. But if you look closely at neuroscience, you will understand something truly terrifying about the human brain. It is called repressed memory, the ultimate survival mechanism for extreme psychological trauma. When a shock violently breaches the limit of what your conscious mind can handle, the suffocating shame of a discovered affair, the sudden, devastating emotional abandonment by your husband, and the physical trauma of a horrific car crash all at once, your brain triggers its most primal defense. It freezes. It takes that horrifying reel of memory and locks it away in a dark, impenetrable vault just to keep your nervous system from completely collapsing. I wasn't lying to myself. My brain lied to me, just to keep me breathing. But here is the brutal, undeniable truth. The conscious mind can forget, but the cells do not. The body keeps the score. The thick, jagged scar tissue buried deep inside my pelvis was the ultimate keeper of the truth. You can weave a web of lies to blind society. You can use deep denial to trick your own mind. But biology is the most ruthless, impartial judge on earth. The sins committed against me did not just vanish into the winter air. No, they hibernated under my skin, waiting 20 years to wake up and demand their payment. I swerved onto the dirt road leading to the edge of our property. The pine trees loomed over me like dark, silent witnesses. Ahead, the faint yellow light of Arthur's hunting cabin glowed faintly through the blizzard. He was in there. The man who had played the wounded martyr for 2 decades. The man who had sentenced me to a life of silent, agonizing isolation, all while washing the blood of my unborn child off his hands. I slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park. I did not grab my coat. I did not care about the freezing wind cutting into my skin. I marched toward that heavy wooden door, ready to kick it open and finally drag his unspeakable cruelty into the light. I reached the heavy wooden door of the cabin. The winter wind was screaming, but my rage was louder. I raised my fist. I was going to beat that door off its hinges. I was going to drag him out into the freezing snow, tear down his righteous facade, and make him look at the monster he truly was. But right before my knuckles hit the wood, my phone rang. The sound pierced through the blizzard like a siren. I almost ignored it. But I looked down, and the screen flashed the name of Leo's rodeo manager. My blood ran completely cold. "Leo." I answered, and the voice on the other end was frantic, breaking apart with panic. "Evelyn, it's Leo." His horse bucked in the chute. He was trampled. "It's bad, Evelyn. They are airlifting him to Billings right now." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, dropping into the snow. The heavy cabin door swung open. Arthur stood there in his flannel shirt, on his jaw clenched in that familiar cold irritation. But the moment his eyes met my face, the 20 years of thick, impenetrable ice between us shattered in a single second. "Leo," I choked out, my knees giving way. He fell. The next few hours were a living nightmare. We rushed to the trauma center in a blinding panic. The entire flight was a blur of roaring helicopter blades and paralyzing terror. Arthur sat across from me, his face ashen, and for a brief, surreal moment, he reached out and gripped my hand. He actually held my hand. For the first time in 2 decades, we were not bitter enemies fighting a silent war. We were just two utterly broken parents, begging the universe to spare our only child. When we arrived, the surgical team had already taken Leo into the operating room. We sat in the sterile, a blindingly white waiting area. The silence here was different from the silence in our mansion. This silence smelled like antiseptic and death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead trauma surgeon walked through the double doors. He pulled off his mask, his face grim and exhausted. "The spinal damage is severe," the doctor said, his voice heavy, "but we managed to stabilize the fractures. The surgery itself was a success, but we have a critical complication." "What do you mean?" Arthur demanded, stepping forward. "What complication?" "The physical trauma triggered a massive systemic shock," the doctor explained slowly. "We ran his labs, and Leo's blood counts are crashing. He is in acute marrow failure. His body has completely stopped producing platelets and red cells. He is bleeding out internally, and transfusions are not holding. He needs an emergency bone marrow transplant, immediately, or he will not survive the week." "We will do it," I cried out, stepping beside Arthur. "Take mine, take his. We are his parents. Take whatever you need." The doctor nodded. "We are rushing an expedited HLA typing right now to see which of you is the strongest genetic match. A parent is usually a partial match, but in a crisis like this, a direct biological parent is his fastest and best chance at survival. The nurses will take you both to draw your samples." They rushed us into separate rooms. As the needle pierced my vein, watching my blood fill the small plastic vials, all the fury, all the buried secrets, all the hatred of the last 20 years completely vanished from my mind. Nothing mattered anymore. Not the timber empire, not the hunting cabin, not even the horrific betrayal I had just discovered about my lost child. Only Leo. Leo had to live. We returned to the waiting room, sitting side by side as the snow continued to bury the world outside the hospital windows. The entire Montana dynasty, the millions of dollars, the vast acres of land, all of it was entirely useless. We held our breath, waiting for the genetic report that would save our son's life. The double doors swung open. The lead surgeon walked toward us, holding a thin manila folder. Arthur stood up immediately. "We are ready," Arthur said, his voice echoing down the sterile corridor. "Take whatever you need from me." The doctor did not move. He looked down at the paperwork, then back up at Arthur. His expression was not just exhausted anymore. It was profoundly confused. "Sir, there has to be a clerical error. When we ran the HLA typing twice to be absolutely certain, an error." Arthur stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Then run it a 3rd time. My son is dying in there." The doctor shook his head slowly. "It is not an error with the blood draw. It is the genetic markers. A biological parent shares exactly half of their HLA markers with their child. But your results, they show absolutely 0 shared antigens with Leo." The hallway went completely, terrifyingly silent. Arthur stared at the doctor. 0, Arthur repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means—" The doctor hesitated, lowering the folder. "It is genetically impossible for you to be Leo's biological father." Arthur froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The absolute certainty in the doctor's voice hung in the air like a guillotine. I could not breathe. My mind was spinning violently, crashing against the walls of my skull. It was impossible. I had Julian 20 years ago, but Leo was 27. I was completely faithful for the first 7 years of our marriage. I swore I was. But then, the vault in my mind burst open. The heavy steel doors of my own repressed memories were blown off their hinges in a single second. 28 years ago, the week before our massive society wedding, a celebration at the estate, the champagne, the dizzying, blinding amount of alcohol, and a face I had buried so deep in my subconscious that I had convinced myself he was just a ghost. Vance, Arthur's old brother-in-arms, his most trusted comrade who had helped him build the first lumber mill, the man who had vanished into thin air just days before I walked down the aisle. I remembered the dark room, the heavy smell of whiskey, the terrifying drunken mistake that I had completely erased from my reality. My knees gave out. I collapsed into the hard plastic chair. Leo, the sole heir to the greatest timber empire in Montana, the boy Arthur had sacrificed everything to protect, did not carry a single drop of his blood, and for 28 years, I had lived in blissful, arrogant ignorance. I slid down the cold, sterile wall of the hospital corridor, my knees hitting the hard linoleum floor. I could not stand. The weight of 28 years of a lie I didn't even know I was keeping finally crushed me. I looked up at Arthur. He was still standing there, staring at the genetic report in his trembling hands, his face completely drained of blood. "Arthur," I gasped, the tears blinding me. "Arthur, I am so sorry." It was Vance. 28 years ago, the week before our wedding. I was so drunk I didn't even know. I swear to God I didn't know Leo wasn't yours. I waited for the explosion. I braced myself for the violence. I fully expected him to tear the hospital waiting room apart, to scream at me, to finally unleash the rage he had kept buried in the ice for 2 decades. He had every right to destroy me. But Arthur did not scream. He did not raise his hand. Instead, he started to laugh. It was not a normal laugh. It was a hollow, grating, terrifying sound that scraped against the quiet walls of the corridor. It was the sound of a man completely and utterly losing his mind. He let the medical report fall from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf, and he covered his face, his shoulders shaking with that dark, manic laughter. "Arthur," I whispered, terrified. He dropped his hands, and his eyes were wide and wild, completely unrecognizable. "You think I didn't know?" he choked out, stepping toward me. "You think I didn't know about Vance?" My breath caught in my throat. My heart stopped beating. What are you talking about? I saw you!" Arthur yelled, his voice cracking. "The night before the rehearsal dinner, I went looking for my best man and I found the 2 of you in the guest house." The room started to spin. The walls were closing in on me. He knew. He had known since the very beginning. "I drove him to the county line that very night," Arthur continued, his chest heaving, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. "I had a loaded hunting rifle in the back of my truck. I told him if he ever stepped foot in Montana again, if he ever breathed a word of it, I would bury him under the lumber mill. I banished him. I erased him from our lives. But why?" I sobbed, clutching my chest. "Why didn't you cancel the wedding? Why did you still marry me? Because you were mine!" Arthur roared, the sheer arrogance of his youth echoing in his broken voice. "Because I built this empire, and I was not going to let some pathetic soldier take what belonged to me. You were going to be my wife. You were my property. And when you told me you were pregnant a few weeks later, I laughed. I thought it was my ultimate victory. I thought I had claimed everything. I thought Leo was my blood, my heir, the absolute proof that I had won." He stumbled backward, hitting the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor right across from me. The great, untouchable dictator of Montana, reduced to a broken shell of a man. "For 20 years, he whispered, his voice trembling with a devastating realization. "For 20 years, I punished you for that photographer. I sat in that freezing cabin, playing the righteous victim. I took your unborn child from you. I locked you in a house of ice because I thought I was the god of our house. I thought I had the moral high ground to deliver justice for your sins." He looked at me, his face twisted in pure, agonizing irony. "But I was raising his son," Arthur cried out, burying his face in his hands, his voice breaking into gut-wrenching sobs. "I gave my entire life, my entire legacy to the blood of the man I hated most. I did this to myself. I sat there on the floor staring at the man I had feared and worshipped for half my life. When the illusion completely shattered, Arthur was not just a tragic victim of my infidelity. He was an active accomplice in his own destruction. His absolute arrogance, his desperate toxic need to own me and defeat his rival had planted the seed of his own ultimate ruin. We had spent 20 years locked in a silent war, pointing fingers, holding grudges, and torturing each other. But the truth was far more horrifying. We were both monsters. We just wore different masks, and our karma didn't come from the outside. We had carefully, meticulously built it for ourselves. Leo did not die. A few days later, a match was found in the National Registry, an anonymous donor halfway across the country. The transplant was successful. Leo was going to live, but the man who had raised him, the king of the Montana timber empire, did not. Arthur's spirit was completely, irrevocably broken. When Leo finally woke up, the truth was already tearing through the estate like a wildfire. Leo knew. He looked at Arthur standing at the foot of his hospital bed, and for the first time in his life, my son didn't see a father. He saw a stranger. "I'm sorry," Leo whispered, his voice weak and hoarse. Arthur didn't say a single word. He just nodded once, his face carved from stone, and walked out of the room. That was the last time we ever saw him as the master of the estate. The vast fortune, the grand legacy of his family name, the hundreds of acres of prime land, all of it suddenly felt like a massive, cruel joke. For 20 years, Arthur had endured the freezing isolation of that hunting cabin because he believed he was protecting his bloodline from my betrayal. He believed he was the righteous martyr. But the agonizing truth was that the betrayal had poisoned the very roots of the tree he was so desperately trying to save. He didn't scream. He didn't demand a dramatic confrontation. He just crumbled. The heavy, impenetrable ice that had shielded him for 2 decades finally cracked, and underneath it, there was nothing left but absolute exhaustion. A week after Leo was discharged, Arthur's lawyer arrived at the mansion. He brought a stack of papers thick enough to fill a heavy binder. Arthur had signed over everything. He transferred the controlling shares of the timber company to Leo. He signed the deed to the estate over to me. He didn't ask for a single penny. He didn't write a letter of explanation. He just legally erased himself from our lives. When I drove down to the hunting cabin that afternoon, his truck was already gone. The heavy wooden door was unlocked, swinging slightly in the winter wind. I stepped inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold gray ash. His leather jacket was missing from the hook by the door. Arthur had packed his things and vanished into the snow, leaving behind the empire he had spent his entire life building. He walked away from the millions, from the legacy, and from the 2 people who had completely destroyed him. He became exactly what he had forced me to be for the last 20 years. A ghost. The morning after Arthur left, I drove down to the hunting cabin. The snow had stopped, leaving the world in a blinding, dead white. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The air inside was freezing. It smelled like stale wood smoke, old leather, and silence. The absolute silence of a man who had spent 20 years locked inside his own mind. I started packing his remaining things. There was not much: a few heavy coats, some worn-out boots, a stack of business ledgers on his heavy oak desk. As I gathered the papers, my hand brushed against a small, weathered leather notebook tucked under a brass lamp. I opened it. It was not a ledger, it was a journal. The dates spanned decades, but the handwriting on the very last page was fresh. The ink was dark, the strokes pressed so violently into the paper they almost tore through. I stood there in the freezing cabin, and I began to read the final words of the man I had spent half my life hating. If anyone ever knew the whole truth, Arthur had written, they would call me a coward. They would call me a pathetic, broken fool for gritting my teeth and staying in a dead house, raising a son that belonged to the man I hated most. Yes, divorce would have been the easy way out. I could have signed a piece of paper, split the assets, thrown her out into the snow, and washed my hands of this entire nightmare. I had the power to do it. I had the right to do it. But they do not understand. I traced my fingers over his jagged handwriting, my chest tightening. The day I saw that genetic report in the hospital, my heart completely died. Everything I thought I owned, everything I thought I had built, was a filthy lie. But then I looked through the glass of the ICU. I looked at Leo lying in that bed, broken and bleeding, calling out for me, calling me Dad. And I realized a truth far more terrifying than the betrayal itself. Blood or no blood. For 28 years, that boy was my life. He was my son. Tears began to blur my vision, dropping heavily onto the yellowed pages. If I tore this family apart, Arthur's letter continued. If I exposed Evelyn's lies and my own arrogant cruelty, I would destroy her, but I would also be executing my own son. How would Leo survive knowing his mother was a liar and the father he worshipped didn't even share his blood? I could not punish an innocent child for the sins of his mother. I could not destroy his world just to satisfy my own wounded pride. So I chose to punish myself. I swallowed the blade. I let it cut my insides to ribbons every single day, just so this family could look perfectly whole from the outside. I dropped the notebook. My knees gave out, and I sank to the cold, dusty floor of the cabin. I covered my mouth. But the sobs tore through me, echoing violently in the empty room. For 20 years, I had convinced myself that Arthur was a heartless dictator. I thought his refusal to divorce me was just a twisted, vindictive way to keep me as his prisoner. But sitting in the freezing shadow of his absence, I finally understood the agonizing logic of the man I had married. His cruelty was actually the most profound, devastating sacrifice I had ever witnessed. He had buried his own heart alive, enduring decades of isolation and silent agony just to protect the innocence of a son that was not even his. I cried until my lungs burned. I cried for the years we had wasted, for the unborn child I never knew I lost, and for the man who had turned himself into a monster just to keep our world from burning down. The ruthless king of Montana was gone, but he had left me completely crushed under the weight of a grace I would never, ever deserve. I am sitting in the great room of the mansion right now, looking out the massive glass windows at the endless miles of pine forest. The Montana winter has returned. The fire is burning in the hearth, but the cold never really leaves this place anymore. The empire still stands. The mills are running. Leo is doing well. He took over the company, and he comes by the estate sometimes. He still calls me Mom. But there is a careful, quiet distance in his eyes now, a polite boundary that tells me the true soul of our family didn't just break. It burned to absolute ashes. We are just ghosts walking among the ruins. Arthur never came back. The hunting cabin sits completely empty at the edge of the woods, slowly being swallowed by the snow. I don't know where he is. I don't know if he ever found peace, or if he is just sitting in another freezing room somewhere, serving out the rest of the sentence for a war we both started. People in this world love to preach about healing. They tell you that time cures all wounds, that if you just apologize enough, forgiveness is a guarantee. But that is just a sweet, comforting lie we tell ourselves to excuse our shallow mistakes. When you commit the kind of betrayal I did, When you plant a seed of deception so toxic that it poisons the groundwater of your entire family, you do not get to just move on. Karma is not a storm that passes over. It is a thick, thorny root that buries itself in your chest and slowly drains the life out of everyone around you. The nature of a liar like me is exactly like a crumpled piece of paper. You can try your hardest to smooth it out, you can press it flat, but the deep, ugly creases will always be there. For 20 years, I craved Arthur's forgiveness to the point of absolute madness. I thought it was the only thing that could save me. But sitting here in this massive, empty house, listening to the lonely echo of my own breathing, I finally understand the core truth. Demanding forgiveness for a crime that completely destroyed another human being's life is just committing the ultimate act of selfishness all over again. Sometimes the best justice is not a tearful reunion, and the only real way out is not finding a way to heal. The only way out is having the courage to accept your sentence. There is no forced forgiveness in this house. No happy ending where we all sit around a dinner table and pretend the past was just a bad dream. I will pray tonight. Not for God to bring Arthur back to me, not even for him to eventually let go of his anger. I will pray that Arthur finds some sliver of light in a place where my dark shadow can never reach him. As for me, I will carry the heavy, suffocating cross of my regret until my very last breath. It is the only way I can return a fraction of justice to this world. If you are listening to my story, if you think a secret is just a temporary shadow you can easily outrun, look at my empty empire. Look at the ghosts I have to share my table with. Some lies do not just haunt you, they bury you alive.